I'll tell you three things about our guest tonight, Rabbi Yoshi Zweiback. The first thing I'll tell you is that he comes from Omaha, Nebraska, and is the recipient of a very expensive education at Princeton University and then at Hebrew Union College, correct? That's true. So far, so good. The second thing I'll tell you is that Stephen Wise Temple, a small, quiet, modest shtibel, which sits upon a hill overlooking the beautiful San Fernando Valley, founded by Rabbi Isaiah Zeldin, may he live and have long years, and Rabbi Zweiback is only the third senior rabbi of the entire congregation, and was chosen last year from a field of millions to lead the congregation to even greater things. And the third thing I'll tell you is that 2 summers ago we were in Israel together at the Hartman Institute, where we hang out and study with other rabbis. There are about 160 rabbis at the Hartman Institute when the missiles began to fall from the sky. And that meant that all of the programs that we had planned to do in the city of Jerusalem were canceled. And Rabbi Hartman, who was the head of the Institute, told us, stay in the Institute, you're safe here, I have a bomb shelter here, stay here and we'll figure out something. And we couldn't figure out anything, and so Yoshi picked up a guitar and entertained 160 rabbis, their partners, friends, and spouses for about 3.5 hours. The missiles disappeared, and there was joy and laughter everywhere. And I will never forget that. That was actually a spectacular, spectacular evening. Rabbi Zweiback is a man of deep soul, of wonderful sense of humor, and of great love. It's a privilege, first of all, to welcome you on behalf of Valley Beth Shalom as our colleague, as the senior rabbi of Stephen S. Wise Temple, and to welcome you to our conversation about the God I know. Welcome, Rabbi Zweiback. You got to speak right into this mic or they'll yell at you.
I will. I don't want you to yell at me. He said you were going to yell at me. I don't know. So, can you hear me? So first I wanted to say thank you to my colleague, Rabbi. When I was given this wonderful honor of being named the next senior rabbi at Stephen Wise Temple, you were the first colleague to reach out to me and invited me for a conversation, a coffee, or a scotch. And we went out and we had the coffee. I think tonight, if you're up for it, we can have that scotch. But a wonderful mentor and a colleague and a most gifted teacher, and it's an honor to be invited to join you. And I saw Nina a little bit ago. I think she's outside. Really an honor to be here with your rabbis, and I saw some of your cantors as well. I'm your neighbor. I live just a few blocks away, so it was really nice to be able to walk here this evening and to join you. So the God I know, allow me to begin with a disclaimer. The fundamental difficulty in talking about God is that we are, after all, then talking about the field of metaphysics. Beyond this world, beyond our intellects, beyond our ability to know very much with any degree of certainty. And as I was preparing for this evening, I found in a file that, you keep files and you wonder, why do I keep these things? Maybe I should just get rid of them all. And I've schlepped this particular file. I schlepped from Los Angeles to New York, where I finished rabbinical school. Then I moved to Los Altos Hills, and I was in Palo Alto for 11 years, suffering Basof HaMa'arav, in the edge of the West, there I was. And then I moved to Israel, made Aliyah, and I lived there for some time, and then I had this incredible opportunity to come to Stephen Wise, so I came back to America. And this file has been schlepped around the world, waiting for this moment, because in the folder, which I found today in a box, is the paper I wrote in 1995 for Rabbi David Ellenson on my personal theology. And I thought that would come in handy as I was preparing for this evening. So this is something I wrote a little more than 20 years ago, and it reflects almost exactly my thinking today. So I'm going to share some excerpts from what I wrote back then and weave in some other things, and I have a text or two to share with you. So this is what I wrote in 1995. I myself have never encountered God in any physical sense. No voices from heaven, no signs, not even kol dmama daka, the still small voice. Occasionally, I'm filled with awe and struck with the utter mystery at the heart of being, a Heschelian God moment. But that passes and strikes me less and less frequently of late. Sometimes I feel commanded by the face of the other, the one I encounter, a Levinasian moment of infinity, God opening up before me. But inexplicably and with disturbing regularity, I manage to walk past, seeing the face yet not feeling the responsibility. I've also experienced that moment of total relational connection as it becomes thou, Buber's God of true meaning. But this as well, I begin to see in more and more natural terms and wonder if God has anything at all to do with that nanosecond of communion in this, our world of objectification. So what can be said about God? Ultimately, I think, precious little. To paraphrase the great Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, I worry about those who describe the furniture of heaven and the temperature of hell. So there's not so much I can say about God, and yet I agreed to speak on the subject for an hour. By the way, is the hour up, Eddie? How are we doing? You told me we're almost there? Okay. So what then can I say about the God I know? So let me begin with the most basic review of normative Jewish theology, and forgive me if I'm repeating what you've already heard before from others, but sometimes in the repetition comes a deeper understanding. So first of all, there is no one way to describe or characterize Jewish theology. Even within the Bible, there are nuances and differences in the way God is portrayed, a move from monolatry to monotheism in Deuteronomy and Isaiah, for example. By the way, monolatry is one of my favorite words. Does anyone know what it means? Monolatry? Monolatry is the belief in one God that is your God of choice, but does not exclude the possibility that there are other gods. So you recognize the existence of other gods, but you say, but Yud He Vav He, that's our God, the best God, the strongest God, that's the God I worship. But yeah, there are other gods out there. So Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai, who is like you among the gods that are worshipped. So monolatry characterizes parts of the Bible, and eventually we get to radical monotheism. There is only one God. There are no other gods. The rabbis of the Midrash and the Talmud have different theological impulses, redefining such essential concepts as reward and punishment, breaking with biblical tradition in the process. The whole notion of how reward and punishment is meted out is changed by the rabbis from reward and punishment being meted out in this world to a rabbinic notion that it's only in the world to come that reward and punishment can be felt and realized. Maimonides, in the 12th century, and in part, he comes to harmonize biblical conceptions of God with medieval philosophy. So there is no one way to accurately characterize Jewish theology. As one of my teachers says, Judaism is a multivocal tradition. There are many voices. So be careful when someone stands up and says, Judaism demands, Judaism believes. There are many voices. But normative Jewish theology is expressed twice daily in the Shema and her blessings. And it has three components. God is creator of the universe. We affirm that with Yotzer Or, with Ma'ariv Aravim. God is the revealer of truth. We affirm that in Ahava Rabbah in the morning, Ahavat Olam in the evening. It's through love that God reveals that truth, but God is revealer. And finally, God is Goel Yisrael and Gaal Yisrael, the one who has redeemed Israel at the shores of the sea, taking us out of Egyptian bondage and into freedom, and God will redeem us in the future. So because you ask, Eddie, I'll share my own thoughts, limited and flawed as they are, about my own theology, and I'll organize them around the normative theological formula I just articulated: creation, revelation, and redemption. According to our tradition, when we see something extraordinary in nature, a giant mountain, a grand canyon, seas, rivers, forests, and the like, we bless Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oseh ma'aseh v'reshit. Blessed are you, eternal our God, ruler of the universe, who makes the works of creation. God is creator of the universe. And I experience the blessing, as we all do, of God's creation each day. Is it possible, as some physicists argue, that the world created itself, that in the infinity of this universe, no beginning and no end, there is not even a creator? It's hard for me to get my puny little mortal mind around such a concept, but I suppose it's possible. But in the world I experience, the God I know created this world, this universe. And this is, for me, the foundation of my faith and my gratitude. It's all I need. And the more I learn about life and about this world and about the laws that govern it, the more grateful I am for this gift, this singular gift of creation, and my gratitude for the God who made creation possible. Now, what about the God that reveals? And here I depart from normative tradition. The notion of a God that reveals a particular truth to a particular people at a particular moment in history is problematic. It's problematic enough that scholars have a name for it. It's called the scandal of particularity. Regarding Judaism, the scandal is that God chose one small people, us, the Jews, to reveal God's truth to. And God chose this one place, Har Sinai, on which to reveal this truth at one moment in time, approximately 3,200 years ago. Both written and oral Torahs were given to us according to our tradition at that moment. But how can a universal truth be particular, so particular? And why would God reveal it to just this one people? Why would it include details of such a particular nature? And even the choice to reveal it in a particular language, Hebrew, is somewhat scandalous. And so, by the way, you know, there are more Hebrew speakers in Encino than there are Mandarin speakers in the world per capita. I'm not sure if that makes any sense at all, but I just wanted to acknowledge that you hear a lot of Hebrew around this part of town. And so here I depart from tradition, seeing Torah not as a document revealed to Moses by God on Mount Sinai, but rather as a text that was developed by our ancestors over centuries. This is a normative belief within liberal Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist Judaism, but it is a break with tradition. So what, if anything, makes the document sacred? A few things. The weight of history, and more personally, the weight of our people's history. It's not just that it's an old document, it's our old document. It's distinct, therefore, and special, and that's the meaning of the word kadosh, set apart, distinct, unique, both by virtue of its age, but because it has meant so much for so long to our family. This makes it sacred and set apart. 2, it includes sublime truths that inspire and uplift and bring meaning to my life. 3, any text, I would argue, that includes these sublime truths that allow us to transcend ourselves and to reach more fully toward the divine. Any text that does that is a revealed text, even though it is written by human beings. This, by the way, allows me to see my people's text as sacred without denying the possibility that other people have their own sacred texts, and even more, that those texts might be, for me, sacred as well. Here's how the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas describes this, and how I think we can read our sacred text in a manner that transcends the scandal of particularity. Each time Israel is mentioned in the Talmud, writes Levinas, one is certainly free to understand by it a particular ethnic group which is probably fulfilling an incomparable destiny. But to interpret in this manner, he argues, would be to reduce the general principle in the idea enunciated in the Talmudic passage to forget that Israel means a people who has received the law. Let me just repeat that last part. For Levinas, Israel means a people who has received the law, and as a result, a human nature that has reached the fullness of its responsibilities and its self-consciousness. So for him, receiving the law doesn't mean the specific 613 commandments and all of the details surrounding them. It means a life of responsibility, a life that allows one to transcend self-interest and to live in a more other-interested and other-centered world. He concludes, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are human beings who are no longer childlike. That's what it means to be Israel. It means to be a grown-up. And you don't have to be Jewish to be a grown-up. So for me, Torah is a human document that's sacred because of its history, but also sacred for me and potentially for anyone because it includes wisdom that enables us to transcend ourselves and become adults who are able to embrace adult responsibilities. One last thought on Revelation, and this again is from my personal theology paper of 1995. We can speak of the effect Torah has had on our world. For millions of people, the texts of our Torah hold ultimate meaning. They are divinely revealed and all-important. I reject that type of theology, as I reject that type of theistic God. However, I am sure that much of this literature is occupied with questions of real human importance. Why do bad things happen to good people? What are my responsibilities to others and to myself? What is the true nature of love, jealousy, forgiveness, war, death, life? It is a literature that is obsessed with ethical living. It is certainly not the only literature which asks and answers these types of questions, nor is it a literature with whose answers I always agree. I only know that for me, its study is indescribably enriching. I only know that for me, it is an inexhaustible source of meaning and inspiration. I'm not sufficiently familiar with Torah or with all of the other literatures of the world to be able to judge how Torah compares, but for me, it is indescribably, inexhaustibly meaningful. And finally, the God who redeems. A God who intervenes in human history, this is a challenge. If God freed us from Egyptian bondage, then why didn't God spare us from the horrors of the Crusades, or the Inquisition, or most painfully, the Shoah? And to be less particularistic, if God were willing to redeem the Jewish people from Pharaoh's army at the shores of the Red Sea, why didn't God save the Armenians? Why not the Cambodians? Why not the Tutsi in Rwanda? Doesn't God love them? Doesn't God care about their suffering? The God I know doesn't intervene in history in this way. Perhaps God could do so, but I have little evidence to suggest that God does do so. And in fact, we can, each of us, point to times in our own lives and in the lives of others when we've witnessed God not intervene. So either God can't intervene because God is limited, or God chooses not to intervene, limits God's self, as it were, for reasons I can't know. God is, to my thinking, transcendent, creator of the universe and the natural laws that govern and regulate it, but who, since then, has remained apart from the world in profound ways. We experienced redemption from bondage in Egypt. I have no reason to doubt that. We were slaves, and we went free. And at some point in our people's history, we attributed that moment of redemption to an act on God's part. Perhaps the reason God doesn't intervene is that the power to bring redemption to the world has already been granted to us. You could argue that God has made redemption possible. Why does God need to actually come in and do the work for us? It's a lack of responsibility taking on our part that would demand that, laziness on our part that would demand that. It's a childish response to expect God to do what God has empowered us to do all by ourselves. Apart from averting natural disasters, which is largely beyond our control and our power, the redemption for which we long is in our grasp. Egyptian bondage was a human invention and could be transcended without any divine supernatural intervention. Likewise, the Shoah, Pol Pot, Stalin, Boko Haram, ISIS. Unfortunately, we could continue that list. Our task and our challenge is not to lose hope, not to give up, but ever to take responsibility for doing our part to redeem the world. And here's what I wrote about redemption back in the spring of 95. And now redemption. I remind the reader of Niebuhr's admonition about otherworldly redemption. I won't waste your time. None of us can know what happens to our essential self after we die. We can therefore only speak of this worldly redemption. But the word redemption itself is decidedly otherworldly. It comes from late Middle English and means literally to buy back or to take back. The implication is that we are taken back by God despite our sinful nature. Often a sacrifice is made to the benevolent one so that we can be redeemed, taken back, or brought back. The Hebrew is even more interesting. The root ga'al, gimel aleph lamed, can mean both to redeem and, you know what else it can mean? To defile. Goal nefesh. Goal nefesh. It's with an aleph. Goal nefesh. Gimel aleph lamed. Perhaps Geulah then is the process by which one moves from defilement to purity. This process is a natural human one. Redemption is possible. We can better ourselves. We can create a more just world. We human beings can redeem our world from defilement and from sin. I find in the literature of the Jewish people inspiration for this type of human redemption, the wrestling with meaning, the struggle to build a world of both compassion and justice. This is our written heritage and our self-imposed mission. So 2 more points and then a text that I want to share with you. So your rabbi, in his invitation for me to appear tonight, for which I'm grateful and honored, asked me to talk about the God I know. And then he wrote, "We're interested in your theology. Who is the God you worship?" And these are 2 different questions. There's a distinction between the God I know and the God I worship. The God I know, or wish I knew, perhaps, is experienced more fully here, in my head. The God I worship, I experience more fully here, in my heart. In worship, I open myself to suspending disbelief. I open myself to faith, which seems ironic if I'm suspending disbelief, to open myself to faith. And I open myself to wonder. In worship, especially when it comes to Geulah, I open myself in prayer. I pray for healing for those I love, and I mean that I hope that God will heal them, even though I don't believe rationally that this is how God operates in the world. I pray for peace, pleading for God, Oseh Shalom, to be Sim Shalom, which, by the way, before it was a great siddur created by the conservative movement, it was actually a prayer. And I mean, when I say that prayer, that I hope that God will make peace on earth, even though rationally I know that that's not God's job, that's our job. So I want to end with a text that I really love that touches on all 3 of these classic theological notions. It's the second text that you should have gotten. It's from Baba Metzia. Of all the Babas, Metzia is one of my favorite Babas. You like that one? This is from Baba Metzia, 83A and B. If you don't have a copy, maybe the person next to you has a copy. We're not going to do the whole text. I just wanted to look at a few pieces of it. And this is something that Levinas, I wrote my thesis in college on Levinas and a book that was published called 9 Talmudic Readings, which are translations of some of Levinas's lectures that he would give yearly at a colloquium of French Jewish scholars. And I'm not a French scholar, meaning I don't know any French. So I wanted to do work on Levinas, but I was limited because I couldn't access some of his works. And then I was very fortunate that the year that I needed to write my thesis, this wonderful book, 9 Talmudic Readings, was published in translation. In fact, I got copies of some of the galleys through my professor before it even went to print so that I could start my work. And this text is actually, the first time I really studied Gemara was with Levinas. It was through an essay that he had written, and it was only later that I got to study Bava Metzia in the original language and understand it in a different way. But it's a wonderful resource, and it's one of the few English language resources that kind of allow you into Levinas. How many of you have studied Levinas? Emmanuel Levinas was a French Jewish philosopher. He died in 1995. He was born in 1904, I think, in the Ukraine. He ended up moving to France. He fought for the French army. He was captured by the Nazis, prisoner of war for 4 years. Most of his family was killed. He stayed in France, and he became a translator. He translated Heidegger into French, and he was a very important philosopher, teacher, and he's an extraordinary thinker. Very dense stuff, but really good stuff. So this is from this is the text, obviously, from the Babylonian Talmud, but the essay from 9 Talmudic Readings includes Levinas's interpretation of this text. So the Mishnah teaches us, he who hires workers and tells them to begin early and finish late cannot force them to do so if beginning early and finishing late does not conform to the custom of the place. So whatever the minhag is, that's how you must act. Where the custom is that they be fed, he's obligated to feed them. Where it is the custom that they be served sweet candy, he must serve them sweet candy. Everything goes according to the custom of the place. However it's done in that place, that's how you do it. That's the law. But now we get a case. One day, Rabbi Yochanan ben Mattaya said to his son, go hire us some workers. The son went and hired them and included food among the conditions. So he said, we'll give you meals while you're working. When he came back, the father said, my son, even if you prepared a meal for them equal to the one King Solomon served, you would not have fulfilled your obligations toward them, for they are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As long as they have not begun to work, go and specify you are only entitled to bread and dry vegetables. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said it was not necessary to say it, for in all matters one acts according to the custom of the place. So that story of Yochanan, I think, is extraordinary. The father says to the son, look what you did to us. You've ruined us. You didn't specify. If you don't specify, then you have to give them a meal that would be fit for a king. You have to specify, because they're descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They would deserve a kingly meal. You can limit your responsibility, but there are limits to your limiting of your responsibility. What can't you do? You can't give them anything. You can't say, even though the minhag is that you get fed, you don't get fed. Or you can't say, we'll play with the expectations of the law, and we'll make it so you're only a 29.5 hour a week worker, and then we don't have to give you this, and we'll 1099 you, and then you don't have to get any health care. You can't do that. If the minhag is that full-time means you get health insurance, you get health insurance. If the minhag is that full-time means you get meal breaks, you get meal breaks. You can't schmear it. But there are ways you can limit your responsibility, which is infinite. But even that has limits. Then the Gemara picks up there. But what I wanted to do to sort of connect this text to these three pieces. So first of all, the God I know, I find in texts like these. This text ends up at the bottom quoting from Psalm 104. And if you flip the page, you can see some of the verses from Psalm 104. And so in the text that's embedded in the text, this intertextuality, you see God's glory through the heavens, the water, the clouds, the wind, the mountains, the springs, the grasses. Through nature, you experience God's creation, and you experience most profoundly the reality of God's presence through the world. And the animals are mentioned as well. In terms of revelation, this text is one example among thousands of Jewish texts of a literature that is obsessed with ethical living. It's a text that is occupied with questions of real human importance. In this case, what are my obligations to my laborers? And can my obligation be limited in any way? And if so, what are those limits? And are there limits on those limits? And how contextual is it? Does it depend on where I am? And are there limits to that? Even if you're supposed to follow the minhag of the place, what happens if the place in which you are operating your business is barbaric? Can you go by that minhag and say, but that's how we do it here? In this part of the world, 10-year-olds are trained to the sewing machine, and they work, and they're grateful for it. Are there limits to that or not? It's what makes it a revealed text, even though it was written by our ancestors and not by God. And finally, redemption. This is precisely the kind of text that might move us from defilement to purity. It's a text that teaches us that the laborer is always inevitably in a vulnerable place, a place where he can easily be defiled. And it calls us, within the boundaries of the practical, to reach for our highest values. The God I know, however imperfectly I know her, or him, I don't know, they, wants us to reach for holiness, for the good, and for redemption. Thank you.
We got questions.
Oh, dear.
We have questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
What grade did you get on the paper?
Well, I actually, I don't want to brag, but I have right here on the paper, Eddie, David Ellenson's comments to me. A very fine paper, Josh. Yeah, it's very good. Oh, I did. Yeah, I showed it to Mom and Dad, and they were proud.
Okay, there's many questions that flow from the rabbi's presentation. But I want to lay one out, and then we're going to take a break. This is our
Okay.
our custom.
Am I supposed to be sitting down? Okay. Okay.
So you mentioned toward the end of the talk.
But now they can't hear
No,
you.
they can hear me. They're fine.
Can you all hear him?
They're used to this. So sit. I don't want you to answer it. I just want you to think, because we're going to get coffee.
Okay. But they can't possibly hear you because you're looking the other
Trust
direction.
me, I'm good at this.
But you made such a point of me using the microphone.
Because you're a guest.
Oh.
The God of your head
Yes.
is not the God of your heart. The God that you pray, you worship, is the God of your heart.
Yes.
And the God of your head is different.
Yes.
And I'm interested in what that means. What does it mean to recite prayers to a God that you don't actually believe in? Or the other way around. What does it mean to believe in a God that you don't have an emotional attachment to? And how important is the integration of head and heart in a theology? Good. Evening, Yoshi.
Good evening.
Welcome.
So I was corrected. Goal Nefesh is with an I, and I apologize. But
with
it's
an
a
I?
good drash. Gaal and Goal.
Okay.
So I'll now just make it a drash, and then
I
you're
want
free to
to
do what you want.
before I want to get to God in a minute, but
Yes.
I actually want to take a small detour.
Oh, yes.
If that would be okay. I know. I'm just talking to him. That's why. Right.
But you could hear him when he was talking without a microphone back towards me. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a skill. It's a skill. For a moment, tell us about Stephen Weiss Temple. You're the new senior rabbi, which means that the synagogue is waiting for a vision. And I wonder what kind of vision that you've offered the temple that's now going to lead the congregation to a new moment.
I only came prepared to talk about the God I know, but I suppose if pressed, I could talk about something else. So one of the things that's been really fun for me over the last couple of years, I came to Stephen Wise in 2012 as the head of school, And that was a new job for me. I'd never run a day school, and it was really wonderful. And part of the process was a process of what nowadays people call rebranding, but it's really just storytelling and helping people understand what you're about. So the school, we focused on 4 things: on deep learning, creativity, experiencing wholeness, a sense of shalom, all for a higher purpose, which is not, believe it or not, to get your 6th grader into Harvard Westlake. There's actually a higher purpose.
There is a higher purpose in Jewish education?
There is, and it's to change the world for the better, to make great things happen in our world. So we changed the name of the school from Stephen Wise Temple Elementary School to just Wise School, because we thought it'd be nice to take advantage of Stephen Wise's name. Some people think his last name was Weiss, which always cracks me up, that it was Stephen Weiss, yeah. But there was a man who actually lived, his last name was Wise. We named a school after him, and we managed to separate the word wise and school by like 9 other words. So, but the focus is really on critical and creative thinking skills, wholeness, for a greater purpose. And on the temple side, over the last year or so, we've been in a process of trying to articulate who we are more succinctly, because we had a mission statement that was 19 paragraphs long, and it was beautiful, but if you asked congregants, what are we about, it was kind of hard for people to get at it. So now we got it to 7 words.
Which are?
I don't remember, but it's just 7 words. Yeah, no. We make meaning and change the world.
Nice.
And then when you get to the Rashi, it's clear that we make meaning in the ways Jews have traditionally made meaning, through the study of Torah and the world's wisdom, through worship and community building. And we change the world in the ways Jews have traditionally done that, through acts of tikkun, through mitzvot, through chesed work. But to really be focused on those 2 things. And since the school has always been at the heart of the temple, Rabbi Zeldin, Matuka Benjamin, their vision from the beginning was really the focus on education. The making meaning part is really a huge, continues to be a huge part of what we do. Over the last few years, the thing that I'm most excited about and proud of, and was there when it happened, but it didn't have anything to do with building it, but I'm so proud to be part of it now, is our freedom schools. So the freedom schools, the Children's Defense Fund created freedom schools in the 1960s in the South to help kids, mostly African-American kids in schools that were underfunded, catch up over the summer through a literacy program that they developed. And many Jews would come down from the north to work in these freedom schools over the summer. So Stephen Wise Temple teamed up with the Children's Defense Fund to start a freedom school 4 summers ago with 80 kids from the San Fernando Valley at a school that's 95% Latino, Title I, Title II school. And those kids come up for 6 weeks of literacy work at Stephen Wise over the summer. And if you'd be interested in building a freedom school here over the summer, we'd love to help. We started a project called the Wise Freedom Schools, which is a separate 501c3, so we can raise money from corporations and other kinds of entities. It's a non-religious nonprofit that supports these schools. And now we have 3 campuses, one at Wise, one at Milken, and one at the AJU. And last summer we had 240 kids working on our campuses, grades 3 through 8, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. Amazing. They come up, they have breakfast, they sing, they have a read aloud, they do grade-based learning, and then in the afternoon they get to have fun. They swim in our pool, they play on our playgrounds, they go to our computer lab. So those are the ways we're trying to change the world.
That's great. That's a wonderful
fun.
project. Let me pursue this for a second. Again, this is not what I asked you to come talk about tonight. So, but you're here, and I have to ask you, and you have to answer. The Pew Report indicated 2 interesting things about the Reform movement. Yeah. The Reform movement is now the largest cohort in American Judaism. It's well eclipsed the conservative movement. And the Reform movement does a remarkable job of welcoming people in. It's much more open door to, say, intermarried couples and people of various kinds of backgrounds. But the problem was that at a certain point, many people left. that a Reform synagogue, this is nationally cohort, I don't know what it is at Wise, but nationally, Reform synagogues seem to have a harder time than Orthodox or conservative synagogues holding on to adult members once their children were finished with the schooling, schooling of the, within the temple. So the question is, do you see that sort of thing at Wise? And why do you think that happens? And what do you think you're going to do about it?
The God I know. Let me tell you a little bit more about...
You thought theology was hard.
Let's go back to Gal Nefesh and Goal Nefesh. Some think it's with an aleph, others with an ayin. Yes, that is something that we experience at Stephen Wise. And part of it is that Stephen Wise has been so school-focused that there are many, many people, and I don't know to the extent to which that happens here with your day school, that there are people who come and join our synagogue because they're looking for a great school, and in order to go to our great school, they need to be a member of our temple. Mm-hmm. But they weren't coming to us because they had a burning need, a fire in their kishkes. By the way, if you've ever had a fire in your kishkes, you should get that looked at right away. To join our synagogue, instead they wanted the school, and we made them take the temple. So then when their kid graduates, their youngest kid graduates, and is it really a shock that they say, thank you, it's been great, but we never really wanted the temple in the first place. So I think that's been part of our culture, and I aim to change that. So one of the ways that we're really looking at that is we did some work with measuring success. I know you guys did the survey, the synagogue survey and the day school survey, and if you look at the drivers of synagogue membership, connection to clergy is a key driver. And if you think about a synagogue like Valley Beth Shalom with leadership, Rabbi Schulweis, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Hoffman, Farkas, we have wonderful, wonderful rabbinic leadership, cantorial leadership. That's going to be a huge reason why people connect and stay. A synagogue that another major driver is the vision of the place, that people can articulate what it is and it resonates in them. This is what VBS is about, and we love that. And a deep sense of community. So the good news is those are all things that we care about. So by focusing more rigorously on each of those, I hope that we'll be able to keep people longer. Mm-hmm. And I don't know in terms of the extent to which, or the degree to which it's different for Jews at a conservative synagogue or Reform synagogue. I read that same study. My own experience is that, it's very contextual. It really depends on the synagogue. Stephen Wise has always been on the more traditional side of Reform Judaism in terms of kashrut, in terms of the liturgy. Our cantor, the great Nathan Lamb, grew up at Adat Ariel. He worked for Rabbi Harold Schulweis for a while. He davens in a more traditional fashion. So we actually have among our membership, we have a lot of people who, if you ask them to define themselves denominationally, they, whatever, I don't think that's terribly important. So, How about you? How are you guys?
It's not a problem here.
Not an issue.
People
well, good.
Come,
Tell me how you've solved it.
People come, they stay forever. We can't get rid of them. That's why I beg them. We don't have parking. Don't come Shabbos.
Take my members, please.
So. It's just simply not a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Fantastic.
It's not been. Sorry, what? Well, the cookies are a big part of it. Yeah. Cookies are a big part of it. Sorry?
We have good cookies too. Not good enough.
So let me ask you one more question along this line. Then I promise you I'll get back to theology, which is in the Reform movement. As you look at the Reform movement nationally or internationally. Where is it going? What is it? Is there a trend that you can see in terms of the narrative or the theology of this movement? Its identity as a movement. Mm-hmm. It's certainly changed in our lifetime. I remember we'd tell a story that my dad once went to a bar mitzvah at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Fool. He brought a tallis and wore a yarmulke, and the usher at the door literally told him to put the tallis away and take off the yarmulke, right? Nowadays, you go to Wilshire and, Steve wears a tallis and a yarmulke and prays in Hebrew. I've prayed in your service and found it more traditional than ours, right? So as you look at the Reform movement nationally, and now that you're senior rabbi of Stephen Oy's Temple, you have a pretty good view from up there.
That's great.
Where's it going?
Well, I tend to be optimistic and hopeful. I don't think that some of the trends that we've seen in the last 10 years are vectored trends, meaning unidirectional trends. I prefer to think of them as what do you call it when it swings back and forth? Pendular trends. So there have been reawakenings and great reawakenings in American Jewish life, in American life, when it comes to religious identity and religious zeal. So I have no reason to believe that something like that is not possible. Usually when movements wax and wane, it does relate to larger American trends. When more and more people bowl alone, and fewer and fewer people join, it makes sense that you have fewer and fewer people joining synagogues. But again, I don't see that as a vectored thing. So I'm hopeful. Our enrollment in our school is right now growing, and because that's such a big driver of our own membership, you don't have a problem. Nobody ever leaves here, but because some people left, we had declining enrollment for a while, and now it's growing again. And I think that has to do with there's a lot of other things that affect that. But what's in our locus of control is, can we create something that's compelling and vibrant, engaging, a deep sense of community? Can we create learning that is meaningful and deep and real? Those things are in our power. We don't have to pray to God to try to get us back to the subject that I thought I was invited here to speak about. By the way, it's a great technique. Invite a colleague, a friend, to come talk about something. Let him slave away, all afternoon on it, and then come and ask him an entirely different set of questions that he's completely unprepared to answer. Hypothetically, you could do such a thing. You would never do that.
No.
But
God forbid. That would be terribly impolite.
One could imagine a world
terribly impolite
in which but I'm honored to be the recipient of that. So I'm hopeful. Not just about my own community, but I am hopeful about liberal Judaism. I think, there's the ever-dying people again and again and again. It's the end of Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism, and the only Jews that will be left in America in 100 years are Haredi Jews. I don't think that's true. And here is some cognitive dissonance for you, Doctor. Even if I thought it was true, I wouldn't believe it. Because what would be the purpose of believing that? Unless you want to quit and get into another line of business. But I'd rather believe that we got not just a chance, we got a good chance. And, and who knows, so many things really are outside of our control. It depends on all sorts of trends and changes and transformations that will happen in American life, economic changes, in 50 years. First of all, 5 years ago, I told you that China there'd be a precipitous, what happened today? It was a good day for the stocks, right? No, it's okay. Yeah.
If you want to buy stocks on sale,
now's a good time.
It was a good day.
Okay.
They're discounted.
If anybody would like shares of my retirement fund, you can have them for cheap.
Right.
But if you had said there's going to be a precipitous change in the what people think of as a vector in China, or if you had told someone 20 years ago that what would happen in Europe is happening in Europe, there's so many things that we don't know about. So what will happen? How will millennials join? People think about millennials as if they're a different. There's like Homo sapien, and then there's this millennial thing which is disconnected from human civilization prior to this point, and that all the things that we care about, people in their 20s and 30s don't care a whit about, forgetting that when many of us were in our 20s and 30s, we weren't joining very many things either. So the idea that millennials will never join, forget about that. The synagogue dues structure has to be completely upended. Everything that you've ever learned about everything is wrong. Really? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Now I'll get to the topic.
I'm done. It's
interesting. We had a wonderful African American minister spoke last week, and when I phoned him, he actually had to fill in at the very last minute for a colleague. And when I phoned him and said, "I want you to come and talk about your ideas of God," his answer was, "Sure." He lives with God. God for him is a very, very real presence in his life. I've asked a half a dozen rabbis to sit in that chair and give their version of the talk, and each one demurred and said, like, "Well, why is that?"
Well, first of all, when your guest came, did you ask him about the Pew study?
I did, of
and
course.
The future of Reform Judaism?
I did, and he had important things to say.
He probably had
by
a
the way.
more coherent answer than I did.
Right. Reform lives matter. It's true.
It's true. We're going to have a march. Nobody's recording tonight, are they?
Oh, it's everything. It's being broadcast live to every household at Stephen Wise Temple. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this afternoon, actually, about members of my synagogue. I'm sure sometimes you hear it from your own members who say, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. I don't really like going to temple. I don't practice Judaism. And then I'll say, but how long have you been a member of Stephen? 47 years. Oh, interesting. And that's not a phenomenon that Christians can relate to. Mm-hmm. I go to church. I don't believe in Christ, of course, but I go to church. I tithe. I give money. If you insult a fellow Christian, I would call the ADL. That's absent, but we're very much at home in it, and it's because we are we're a people, we're a nation. Why rabbis would be uncomfortable talking about God? That I actually don't have a great answer to that one. I've always been comfortable, maybe overly comfortable, talking about God and what I affirm and what I am unable to affirm. And then every now and then, people respond in shock and horror. But I always thought that was a healthy, good Jewish thing to do, talk about God.
So let's take the point that you left off with in the talk. You made this interesting distinction toward the end of the talk between the God I know and the God I worship. And your distinction was the God I know is the God I know from my head, and the God I worship is the God I encounter with my heart. Tell us why a distinction, and how does one pray to a God that your head tells you doesn't exist?
Has Neil Gaiman come and spoken recently?
Noah Farkas has, who's as close to Neil Gaiman as you're going to get on this coast.
So The Death of Death, I remember reading that, I think with David Ellenson in one of his classes. And there's a notion that Gilman talks about the willed naivete. When there's something that you want to believe and you have a hard time believing it, or you are unable to believe it. You can't make yourself believe that, but you somehow allow yourself permission. You give yourself permission to believe that which you have a hard time believing. In the death of death, that notion is the resurrection of the dead. So it might be a notion that you have no difficulty believing, but if you have a hard time believing in bodily resurrection, or even a spiritual resurrection, or some type of Gilgul HaNishamot, a reincarnation of souls, whatever it is, and those are all normative. Gilgul HaNishamot I wouldn't call normative, but bodily resurrection is certainly a normative Jewish belief. But you might have a hard time embracing that logically by willing yourself to believe it, or giving yourself permission to believing it at certain moments in your life. You can be comforted in certain ways. So my mother died when she was 59 years old, and when she was sick, I would offer Mishaberach l'refuah, for her. But did I believe that maybe God would decide to save her, while God would decide to let a 3-year-old baby die of leukemia? That didn't really make sense. I couldn't believe that. But I really found a sense of comfort in saying this prayer for her. And sometimes I thought about it in terms of the caregivers and, her oncologist. Maybe he could try something new that no one had thought of, or maybe the technician could cook up some kind of chemo that would be the magic chemo, and I could think about the prayer in that way, which is very rational. But I actually found it more comforting to just want God to come save her, knowing that was not going to happen. God was not going to save my mother. But I found great comfort in praying for that. And when she died, the notion of resurrection of the dead, of seeing her in the afterworld, of Olam Haba, of this kind of antechamber that she'd be waiting in, even though my rational self had a hard time believing that. I say, and it's in the new Reform Prayer Book, which shows you how much the Reform movement has changed, but Mishkan Tefillah includes a Nusach, a version that has Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, and I find it very comforting to say it. But if you say, do you believe that? Is that really going to happen? When we lift up the Torah, I say, V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe. I don't really believe that this is the Torah that God spoke, because I talked about the scandal of particularity. It would be scandalous to believe such a thing, and yet I say it because it's so nice to think that this Torah that we cherish and celebrate is the very Torah that God spoke to Moses, and that great chain of telephone that comes down to this day. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how it works for me.
I in no way want to disrespect the son who mourns for his mom, but I want to press you on this a moment from your position as a rabbi.
Right.
You and I encounter all the time Jewish people who say, Rabbi, I have a hard time with prayer. Mm-hmm. I just have a hard time coming to shul and reciting these prayers. Do you suppose that one of the reasons they have a hard time reciting these prayers is because we're reciting words that we don't believe?
Yeah, that's...
I mean, would it be easier to recite words that we did believe?
Right. Well, I think one way to do it would be, and this is how the early reformers, the different, the reform movement was a liturgical reform. Those were the big changes they made. A lot of people think that German reform was an egalitarian movement, for example. It wasn't. Men and women still did not sit together. That was an American reform change. The changes at the Hamburg Temple and the early German reformers were all liturgical changes. And they said, we cannot say these words that we don't believe. We must change the words. So that was one approach. And the more radical reformers changed everything that they didn't believe. So they took out V'zot HaTorah. They removed Kol Nidrei. Anything that they said, we don't believe, we're not going to say it. There was real integrity to what they did. Mm-hmm. But they murdered the tradition. They destroyed it. And most Jews don't care what Kol Nidrei is about. They want their melody. They want Kol Nidrei. They want to hear that. But if you really sat down and studied what it's all about, you might say, well, I don't know if I really want to say that. I'm not sure if I believe it or if I even like what it suggests. We're going to make some vows, but some of them are not really vows. It's like, I've got my fingers crossed, as it were, to mix metaphors. So let's not change those things because it's too powerful. So my approach is I try to teach a lot about prayer so that you can empower people to understand it poetically and metaphorically. And there's all sorts of things that we use language that way all the time. Did you see the sunset tonight? I mean, you and I both know the sun doesn't set, but we're perfectly comfortable with that kind of language. We use poetry, we use symbolism, metaphor all the time. And prayer can have that effect on us, or we can say things that we wish were true, but we might not fully believe. But it'd be nice. Mm-hmm. So it would be really nice if God healed the sick. I don't think that's how it works, but there's nothing wrong with that. The things that I have a really hard time saying are things that the words themselves violate a principle I care about. Mm-hmm. So I don't say Shelo Asani Isha, because I find that harmful. But to say, God, you heal the sick, it's not harmful, unless it encouraged me to don't take your medicine, Eddie. I mean, God will just heal you. No, that might be harmful, but I don't think you need to go ad kadei kach, if that makes sense.
Well, but it's a question of, so we're trapped between two impulses. There's an impulse to preserve a tradition, right, as it's been handed to us because we have an emotional attachment to that tradition. And then there's an impulse to recite words that I really believe.
Right.
Right? I'm sometimes jealous when I visit a church, and I see people praying, first of all, in the vernacular,
right,
in a language that's their language. I mean, we,
right,
we pray a step beyond, because we pray in Hebrew, and even if you know Hebrew well, it's not the language you're going to order lunch in.
Right.
And second of all, you're praying words that it would take some metaphorical work to try to come to an understanding of those words.
Right.
Would we be more comfortable praying words we really believed, or not praying words at all?
Right.
Or changing the whole enterprise?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, for many Jews, not understanding the language is not a barrier, but it rather is very freeing.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what.
So Rabbi Schulweis used to have a wonderful saying. He says, "The nicer the melody, the more questionable the theology.
Why did they have to dress it up so much?
No,
right?
it's true.
Yeah.
Shabbos afternoon, it's uvayoim, 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 my Shabbos, shnei kvasim b'neisha, 2 cows, you're going to slaughter them, spritz the blood everywhere. If you knew what that meant, you'd never say it, V'chol, Shabbat Yontiv, it's
the melody really
v'chol
fits
maminim, everybody believes, and you start reading it in English, you say, I don't believe any of this stuff,
Right.
The nicer the melody,
But you say it, don't you?
Well, but again, because you have this emotional attachment
Right.
to the act of praying,
Right.
but you have a distinctive, sense of division between head and heart. When you
I think it was Elliot Dorff in Minhagami, my people's prayer book. He's got a wonderful commentary on the Amidah, and he bless you.
Gesundheit.
And when I say bless you, I mean it with my head and my heart.
well, let's see who sneezed first before you bless them. Okay,
Is it one of Eddie's congregants or mine?
that's right.
So Elliot Dorff writes about the Amidah, the Bakashot, as expressions of values that you care about. So when you say, God grant us wisdom, you don't really mean I don't have to read or go to school. If I just say this prayer, God will make me smart. Some type of divine osmosis, God will just put it into me. You know that you still have to learn, and you have to read, and you have to study, and you have to work. If you're going to glean wisdom, you have to listen and grow and experience and fail and be beaten down by life and get back up again. That's what wisdom is, and you're only going to get that if you earn it. But when you say those words, you're not asking God to give it to you. You're saying this matters. Wisdom matters. And that's why I'm going to pray for it. And healing matters. You're not saying I want God to heal, but when you say, blessed are you, God, Rofeh HaCholim, you're saying health is really important. And all the other things in the Bakashot of the Amidah, the requests, the petitionary part of the Amidah, are really an expression of our values. I think it's a really elegant move. I think he would agree that we're not actually asking God to make those things real. Sim shalom. We don't have to talk to our enemy. We can just say sim shalom, and God will make it all work. That would be irresponsible. That would be childish to believe such a thing. So when we say it, do we not believe it? No, we do. We believe it. We're saying peace is so important that we're going to pray for it every single day, and hopefully those prayers will be translated into actions on our part. And we can't make peace all by ourselves, so we have to hope that others will do their part. And we'll be able to achieve peace.
Going back to the beginning of your talk, so you gave us an outline of creation, revelation, and redemption.
It's my own little thing that I came up with.
It's very nice,
Right, no,
actually. It works out very well.
It was a joke.
The creation mode, you said, that you experience in moments of gratitude for the gifts of the world, right? Revelation, you talked about this notion of becoming an adult and gaining a sense of responsibility for the world. And in redemption, you talked about your difficulty with understanding a God who intervenes in history and trying to figure out what it means to say, I believe in a God that has some role in history. And if I understood you correctly, what you concluded at the end of that discussion was that your belief in a redemptive God is to believe that the components of redemption are present in the world, and we are called upon to act in such a way to activate that, to make that. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
To make that real. So when someone comes to you as a rabbi and says, but I've experienced a tragedy. I've experienced something in my life which has shaken my world. And none of those modes of God's presence work for me anymore. I don't see a world, the language you used was the gift of creation. I see a world which is rather cold and dark and absurd. And I don't see a world that reveals to me a sense of responsibility. I see a world which reveals a sense of rejection. And I don't see a world that contains redemption, because the things that I would have held on to as my symbols of redemption have been taken from me. Mm-hmm. If a person experiences that sort of loss or evil, so in your theology, how do you respond to that? Mm-hmm. What do you say back?
Right. Well, so much of the way we see the world is colored by our own experience, and as much as you can try to understand another person, There's another big word that I like. It's called ipseity, I-P-S-E-I-T-Y. It's a real word. It means something that is universally experienced, but that every single person experiences it in a unique way. So the self is an example of ipseity. You know what it is to be saddled with yourself, and I know what it is to be saddled with myself. Each one of us is trapped inside our own world. So we all experience that, but I can't possibly be inside of yourself ever. And that's the reality of, a person's experience of God or experience of creation. So I might say, look at the beauty of this world. It's fantastic. Oh my goodness, there's all of these solar systems. And maybe once, a long time ago, there was, a little bit of water on Mars. But that's not like standing on, the Palisades looking out in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, there's no place in the universe that we know of. I'm sure there's somewhere in the corner of the universe a place we haven't found yet, but there's no place we've discovered that contains this. So the miracle of our existence, it blows my mind, and I'm filled with gratitude. But if another person were to say, yeah, but Ebola, Rabbi, Ebola. Yeah, that's true. Ebola's out there, but most of us don't die of Ebola. Most of us actually enjoy health in ways that perhaps even we don't deserve. How do you help someone to see the world in an entirely different way? I think that's a big challenge. I'm not, a clinical psychologist, so all I am is a rabbi. So the best I think I can do is share Jewish wisdom about those things. So the blessing, Oseh Ma'aseh V'Reishit. Okay, so, but did you see the sea? Okay, so say the blessing, And by the way, when I say that blessing, my heart and head are completely united on that blessing, because I see creation, and I say thank you, God, for creation. I have no issues there. When I experience a moment of chesed in the world, and you see someone love another person or show kindness. Actually, walking over here, I was walking past the McDonald's. Is that a kosher McDonald's? Didn't see it?
If the world would be redeemed,
I was walking past the kosher McDonald's.
I think kosher McDonald's is an oxymoron.
I've eaten at one, as I'm sure you have too.
Yeah, and got sick for 3 days.
I was sick. It's true. You only have one. That's the thing, Eddie. You don't go and have like one kids meal. That's it.
I just looked at the menu.
Yeah. So I was walking by the McDonald's, and there was someone driving out of one of the office buildings over there, and they almost ran me over. It's dark, and I'm walking down the sidewalk, and there aren't that many people walking at night. And I pulled myself back, and I walked around the back of the car, and there were 3 young women in the car, and they rolled their windows down. Actually, I don't know if they even make windows that do that anymore. I think they did that. And the window went down, and they said, sorry, all 3 of them, so sorry, we didn't see you there. And it was there was just something kind of sweet about it, It was like...
They were board members at Stephen Weiss.
Yeah, could be. Sorry, we didn't hit you.
Yes, that's what they meant.
So whatever the moment is, you just see people being civil to one another or just being kind to one another. Do you see that as... wow, that's really nice. It's a stranger reaching out to another person. So how do you help someone see the world in a different way? I think that's not an easy thing to do. That was a bit of a dodge, but how would you respond? What would you say to that
But the
person?
question is, when someone faces an experience of evil, tragedy,
right,
and their world is shaken, right? And they come to you and they say, I really want to see the world through the very lovely, optimistic eyes you've described, but I just can't. That's not my experience of the world. Then what happens at that point? Or why am I the one that has to suffer when the rest of the world gets to have pretty sunsets?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't try to, when someone's burying their dead, don't try to give them a nechemta at that moment. So I certainly wouldn't. I think just listening to someone and giving them a hug if they wanted a hug, or just listening can be helpful and certainly respectful. But I actually posed this question to Eugene Borowitz once. I'm dropping names, right and left. I mean, Elliot Dorff and Neil Gilman. So Eugene Borowitz is the great theologian of the Reform movement. And I asked Dr. Borowitz once, he writes in one of his books that around the question of the problem of evil in the world. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen at all in the world? And he said, to be fair to God, most of us experience goodness in this world that is not consistent with the lives we live, meaning most of us get better than we give. And we live lives of plenty that we don't deserve. So why don't we say that that's the problem of God's justice, that how come we got it so good? And I asked him about that, and I said, well, Dr. Borowitz, what about people who are starving to death in Africa? And there was a famine going on at the time, I think in Ethiopia or someplace like that. I said, what about those people? Do you think they would agree with what you just said? And he thought for a moment. He said, most of them don't commit suicide. Mm-hmm. I said, that's interesting. Say more about that. He said, suicide's a reality, and God forbid, and people do take their own lives, but most people, no matter how bad it gets, actually don't make that choice. And his understanding of the world is that even there's so much hope that even in the midst of trauma and pain and all sorts of awful things, most people hold on to life and hang in there. And it was a powerful response. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that person who says those things?
First of all, you got to listen, of course, and I think I think I'm less theistic than you are. And having hung around with Schulweis all these years, the idea of a God who inhabits the world and abides with this evil in some way, I think to me ends up in a bad place. That's an offensive idea, because at a certain point the person's going to be able to, well, then why does that God let this happen to me, right? And that's the opposite. It's not just a problem for theology; it's the problem for theology. Right. The Bible begins with the creation of a world out of chaos. The fact that there's chaos that abides in the world means it undoes everything that religion does. And the problem is that it then dumps back on that person. Well, you must have deserved what happened to you. Right? You either end up with the split thinking is either you deserve what happened to you, or you didn't deserve what happened to you, and God's just cruel. Right? And then the worst part is when people say, well,
so either you're bad or God is unfair.
Yeah, one or the other. Or God has some secret plan that he'll never tell anybody that,
Yisurin Shel Ahava, the rabbis.
So Schulweis wrote this wonderful book where he said basically that's the end of personal theology, because you can't answer that question. So now let's find a different way.
Right.
And it comes close to what you had at the very end, your basic notion of responsibility, that a deep sense of responsibility, an inescapable sense of responsibility, is where theology ends up. Mm-hmm. Where theology ends up. But he comes at it in a different way than you did. Let's take a few minutes and get some questions. I got plenty more I can ask the rabbi, but I know that some of you do. We have the microphone, so we're going to play Carol Merrill here. This is Louise Spitzer, who's on. Hi, Joe.
Rabbi Feinstein, what separates you from Rabbi Zweiback to say that I am not a Reform rabbi, I'm conservative? And Rabbi, what separates you from Rabbi Feinstein to say I am not a conservative rabbi, I'm Reform?
About 1.5 miles up a hill. That's what separates us. We're actually very close together. We're good friends. We're neighbors. We like each other very much.
Speak for yourself.
See, that's what happens when you let God in your life.
Right.
You see?
Sometimes people make distinctions between category and degree differences. So I would say that Reform and Conservative Judaism are degree differences, not category differences. They're not different categories. Orthodoxy and non-Orthodoxy are category distinctions. And within Orthodoxy, there are degree distinctions. Okay, so you're modern Orthodox. I don't know. Actually, you might decide that modern Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy is a category distinction. And I think for most Jews who belong to conservative or Reform synagogues, if there are any differences at all, they're degree differences. But the fundamental distinction is classically around Revelation. Is the text divinely authored or not? And what is the authority of that text? And within liberal Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, it's however you want to smear the human component of it, human beings are in the mix in a very powerful way, in ways that they're not in traditional modes. That's how I'd answer it. So that they're degree differences, not category differences.
Yeah, and there's also a difference between the different. It's more of, I think I would say the differences among congregations are more distinct than among movements. We are probably closer to Stephen Weiss in our practice than we are to Beth Am, which is a traditional conservative synagogue. Or if anyone grew up in a conservative synagogue in Chicago, Cleveland, or New York, or Baltimore, even worse, you know. No, it's just Baltimore happens to be a very traditional community. We're probably closer in that way. It's more an individual institution in its style than rather movements have ceased to become movements, ceased to be movements, and are much more sort of federations of styles. Okay, that's one. The second thing, I think, my hunch would be that the idiom is different. If you sat in Stephen Weiss for a whole day and you sat at Valley Beth Shalom for a whole day, you'd hear a different idiom. The language is different. The approach is different. There's some subtle presumptions of what's different. I think that you'd find some differences there. But basically, in terms of how we practice Torah, how we practice the seriousness with which you practice, you'd find a lot of overlap.
One of the fun things about living in post-modernity is that all sorts of things become possible. So this Sunday, I officiated at an Upshirin. Have you done many of those?
Yeah. A
Which
3-year-old
at JTS they probably didn't.
No, I had to look one up. I had to look up the ceremony.
Did Chancellor? Who ordained you?
Who ordained me?
Yeah.
God.
Who was it?
Gerson Cohen.
Right. If I had asked, David Ellenson wouldn't care, but if you had asked some of the early reformers, Upshirin is a cutting of a little boy's hair for the first time at age 3, and if someone had told me, when I was in rabbinical school that someone would come and ask me for that, I would say I can't imagine that would happen.
Yeah, little kid, they grow their hair out till 3, and then you have a ceremony to cut the hair. And you did that ceremony, did it?
It was great. It was really fun.
That's wonderful.
It's like, there's a little bit of like a Brit Milah sort of vibe because, but you kind of get to be the moil, but you're just cutting the hair, so nobody's nervous, and the consequences of getting it wrong are not terribly meaningful.
Yeah.
So it was great. Really fun.
So I had the opposite experience. I had a woman called me, a member of the synagogue called me and asked me if I would do her daughter's wedding, and I happen to know this kid. It's a wonderful family and a wonderful child. I mean, just spectacular kid. And then she says to me, well, would it make a difference if I told you that my daughter is marrying her female partner? Would you do that kind of wedding? And I said, well, yeah, I would, of course, because I know the kid and I know what kind of depth that she has, and it would be a privilege to be part of that. So would it make a difference if I told you that her female partner is Buddhist? And not just Buddhist, but a practicing Buddhist, like, frum Buddhist. And I said, that's beginning to make of an issue, something I need to talk to you about and talk to your daughter. I got to find out what this means. And I said, can I ask you an odd question? Your lesbian daughter is marrying her Buddhist partner. Why would you want me to come and do the wedding? And she said, Rabbi, we're a very traditional family. And but she meant it with no irony whatsoever. And she meant it. We're a traditional family. You've been our rabbi. You've participated in the life of our family.
Why wouldn't we want you there?
You know this kid. You love this kid. You'd love her partner. Her partner loves coming to shul, Why wouldn't you want to participate? And that's the other side of it. And so this is postmodernity, right? Who's got the mic? Oh, Douglas, go ahead.
Actually, at my traditional conservative shul, where I grew up in New York in the 1970s, they hired a young cantor from Los Angeles. And, actually had a recommendation from Rabbi Schulweis, and that was Nate Lamb.
Wow. Long Island.
Long Island, New York.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to ask you about ritual. When I went to a bar mitzvah at Stephen S. Weiss, they were doing the Kedusha. And in the Kedusha, the part where they say, Shenit li'enei kol chai, for a second time in front of all those living, I am the Lord your God, which is the words from the Ten Commandments. and the word shenit came out. And they just said, Liene kol chai. And I'm scratching my head going, the military term would be Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, or WTF. I just didn't understand the basis of taking that out. Mm-hmm. Can you explain
what does Whiskey Tango Foxtrot mean? Why Shenit was taken out in our prayer book at Stephen Wise Temple? Yeah. I taught liturgy for 3 years at HUC, and that's not a removal that I'm on the spot I can answer. There's a wonderful compendium to Gates of Prayer when it was first released that explained sort of every change that was made. I'm not sure about that. Most of the changes that were made were either around repetition. So if something was, and that wouldn't be the case here, but if something was highly repetitive, the old joke where they come to the ritual director comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, the service is just too long. People come an hour late on purpose because they can't stand how long the service is. You got to do something about it. And they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm not changing anything. We're not changing tradition, the Masoret. And finally, he says, fine, we'll take out the second Yikum Porkan. And that's the joke.
That's a liturgy teacher's joke.
It's a liturgy teacher's joke.
Right.
So because there's so much repetition in the traditional service, the things are taken out for that reason. Sometimes things are removed because it's a piyut that actually no one, including its original author, knows what it means. So we keep saying this, but scholars of Hebrew poetry don't really know what it means anymore. There's incredibly arcane, mystical references that nobody gets. That's removed. Or because it's simply something we don't believe anymore. So the conservative movement, for example, the business about the kvasim, it's the memory of it's that we don't literally want to return to animal sacrifice, but we celebrate remembering that moment. So that particular removal, I don't know. But usually it's around one of those three things.
Mm-hmm. Michael.
I'm thinking about Saul Alinsky, the great Chicago professor who wrote a book on the ethics of means and ends. And he really spoke about the great irony that your values change depending on how close to the wall you are. If you're up against the wall, things that you normally wouldn't value, you value a lot. And I think one of the great ironies in Judaism is that when things are bad, religion is best. And the problem now, even with all of the constant chatter from Israel and all that news, is that things are pretty good here. And there's affluence, and people are into assimilation and living the great American dream. And so why should they pray to God? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the irony, that great irony in religion, that when things are good, religion isn't so good. And when you're poor, and when you're sick, and when there's war. One of the greatest evenings I had at Stephen Wise was when the Scuds fell in 1990, and everybody came to pray for the safety of, that was a great experience. But do we have to wait until where our back is against the wall before we have an authenticity in our religion?
Yeah, I think, when do we have sort of the deepest spiritual needs and the spiritual yearnings? Is it when we're most vulnerable? Is it when a good friend of ours, Ken Chasen at Leo Beck Temple, wrote a wonderful sermon once called "Why Me, God? Why Me?" And the twist that he gave was, when all the good things happen, why aren't we saying, "Why me, God? Why me? What did I deserve to have this?" I do talk to colleagues about this frequently when we're at conventions and those kinds of things. I say how lucky I think we are. We could have been rabbis 70 years ago. And we could have been challenged in ways that it's not that there are no challenges in our world. It's not that there's nothing, difficult in Jewish life. But or we could have been rabbis 100 years ago, living in the Pale somewhere, without a congregation to support us in any way. Poor and persecuted and cold. We just got a new family that joined our synagogue from Moscow. They just relocated. I asked the dad, I said, what's the temperature in Moscow today? He said it was minus 20 Celsius. So, which is like minus 4 Fahrenheit. You could be persecuted, poor, and freezing your tochas off. So how do we get it so good? Were we more spiritual and do we believe more deeply when it was so bad for us? I think there is something to that. At the same time, there's I think something, and there's more and more studies that are being done about gratitude, and people who are more grateful live longer and are healthier and are more pleasant to be around, et cetera, et cetera. So could prayer be a mindful spiritual practice that just makes you happier and better and healthier?
Yeah. Michael, I want to challenge the premise of your question, and I'll tell you why. And I'm not naive, because I know the statistics better than most, because I read this stuff, professionally. But first of all, in 1964, Look magazine, which was the second biggest news magazine in the country, did a cover story called The Vanishing American Jew. And the professor was a sociologist, and he says, look, American ethnic groups last 3 generations: the immigrant generation, the firstborn, and the second-born generation. By the end of the second-born generation, you have the third-born generation, you no longer have immigrant parents anymore. That's when Italian Americans stopped being Italian American, and Irish Americans disappeared. And that's when we become, when ethnics disappear, it becomes kitsch instead of serious identity. And the irony is that Look magazine's gone and we're still here. We're now into our 5th and 6th generation of American settlement, American Jewish settlement. Yes, but what's interesting is you could make, I know the statistics, but frankly, we're so used to being pessimistic, right? That when you look at the gestalt from a complete, from a real bird's eye view, you could make the case that we're much more Jewish now than we were 100 years ago.
From an institutional point?
Yes, for example, every major American university now has Jewish studies on a campus. I was at SMU in Dallas when they hired Susie Heschel. Southern Methodist University hired Susanna Heschel to teach Talmud to Buffy and Biff, right? Now, you understand that there was
Buffy
a time...
and Biff Cohen, by
there
the
was
way,
a
just
time...
So you know.
Yeah, Buffy and Biff, Ben Avram. There was a time when Jews couldn't get into American universities, much less study Talmud on the campus of an American university. That the numbers of Jewish books being produced, the numbers of children in Jewish schools, the numbers there's a way of looking at the community where you can see that there's such a huge cultural renaissance and resurgence going on that's hard to believe. That's really very hard to believe. And we don't look at it that way because we're trained not to, number one, and because it doesn't raise a lot of money if I tell you things are good. But there really is a real sense in which there are elements of resurgence in the community that are much more positive than anything we've ever experienced in our lives.
You don't think the empty seats in both your congregations have any meaning?
Well, the first interesting thing is, 100 years ago, there was no Jewish building in the world as big as Stephen Weiss Temple. I'm not making that a joke. Think about what they've built on that hill. Think about what we've built here, right? I happen to be rebuilding it now, so I know all the statistics about how many square feet. But what kind of a community ever built a synagogue this big or that big? Or built a synagogue that big and a synagogue this big, 1.5 miles apart from each other, and there's enough of demand to fill it up? Again, think about the cultural power of the community. Yes, believe me, I want the place to be overflowing on Shabbos, and I'd be delighted if that happened, right? But I'm not so pessimistic as this. I'm really not. So that's the first answer to your question. And the second answer to your question is that throughout Jewish history, the same complaint has always been lodged. And some people were with me this afternoon. We were studying Jeremiah, who stood on the steps of the first temple, saying to the people of Israel, "You're blowing it. You're forgetting who you are and why you're here.
This has been a constant refrain because when you have a faith that offers infinite expectations of spiritual development, and people who live in the material world, there's always going to be a gap between the two. There's always going to be a gap between the two. So I'm not nearly as pessimistic as the community sometimes demands us to be, and I see a great deal of resurgence in the community. Who has the mic? Pop.
I got the mic. I'm sure you're familiar with the writings of Rabbi Schulweis. What's your concept of his Elohim and Adonai concept?
Well, I just wanted to just take 1 second to respond to Michael, just to piggyback on Eddie. When you think about empty seats and where you have Tushy's in seats, what I think is very exciting about both of our synagogues and other synagogues in Los Angeles, if someone had told Rabbi Magnin, for example, may he rest in peace, that his synagogue would have not just one day school but 2 day schools, I think.
And rabbis who wear yarmulkes.
Yeah, but rabbis wearing yarmulkes and kosher, catering at I think he'd say, you're out of your mind. So when I think of, yes, it's true, on a Friday night at 6:15, given all sorts of things, including traffic in this city, it's not a simple thing to get people there. But on Monday morning at 8 a.m., I have 525 students from early childhood to grade 6 on our campus. And down here there are hundreds of students. And then you go to Wilshire Boulevard and they have their students in Sinai, and there's 37 day schools, I think, in Los Angeles. So it's pretty extraordinary. So, yes.
Let me tell you, you would have an overflowing crowd.
Yeah.
You would have 2 hours of Torah study and a half an hour of davening.
Thanks, Dad. That's appreciate it.
Did I ever tell you how to make Danish? Did I ever tell you put more chocolate in the chocolate chip Danish? I didn't tell you how to do your business.
But he's your father, so you should. It's different.
I love him and respect him, and I never told him how to make. He was the best baker in the world, right?
I've had the opportunity to study some of Rabbi Schulweis's writings and have several of his books in my personal library, and have an opportunity as well to spend a little bit of time with him, but never got to know him very well. Rabbi Hersher has told me, and Cantor Lamb, just on a more personal level, have shared with me so many stories about your rabbi and what he meant to them. Ailey told me when Jewish World Watch was created and Rabbi Schulweis reached out to colleagues, how moved Ailey felt to be able to support in a small way, the work that you've done, and in the time that I've gotten to know Eddie, to see the relationship between colleagues and also a rabbi for you, just tremendous respect for everything he helped to build here, and Nate Lamb told me about working with Rabbi Schulweis. So.
The answer to the question is, when Rabbi Zweiback talks about creation, and he says that the Creator God, he encounters the Creator God when he looks into the world of nature and feels a tremendous sense of gratitude to live in a world that is beautiful and nurturing. That's what Rabbi Schulweis meant as Elohim. In other words, I get a sense of gratitude and wonder from that, but I don't expect to find morality in that world, right? When he says that, when he talks about a Redeemer God, and that to believe in a God of redemption yields a powerful sense of responsibility to carry forward the work of redemption in the world, because the elements of redemption have been given to us, and the plan for redemption has been given to us, and what's simply missing is the will to energize ourselves to do that redemption. That's what Rabbi Schulweis would call Adonai.
That's what I meant to say. Exactly the way. Pops, that question is so elemental. I am going to allow my carriage driver to answer that. If you know that story. No, thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate that distinction.
Well, who has the microphone? Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Paul. Rabbi Zweiback, you wrote that most excellent paper, thesis, whatever it was, back some 21 years ago. And we know as life goes on, relationships change. So the first day of your marriage is on one level, and now years later, it's on a different level. And I assume that some thought has gone into how your relationship and understanding of God has changed over the last 21 years. And I believe that's also true for you, Rabbi Feinstein. So the whole topic is one's thought or one's belief or one's concept of God. And that's what the series, I understand, is supposed to be. So I'm asking, since relationships are not static, but transform with time, I'd like both of you to answer the basic question. What has transpired over the last 20, 30 years of being a rabbi and being involved with Jewish theology?
Good. How have you changed since you got that B on that paper?
Yeah. In the 21 years since I wrote that excellent paper, by the way, I become a father 3 times over. I lost my mother. I've had other, moments of exaltation and moments of misery in my life. As a rabbi, I've buried children and people who've committed suicide, and I've sat in hospitals, all the things that we experience in life. And my theology hasn't changed. My understanding, it was the first time I've read this paper since I turned it in, and I found it, after schlepping it around the world, having never once looked at it. And most of what I shared with you this evening, I'd already written when I found it. I actually remembered it. And just to show you how different our world is, I was looking through my Google Drive. I was trying to find the paper somewhere digitally, and then I realized it's saved on a floppy disk somewhere. Remember those? And it's like I have to find the hard paper, and then today I scanned it and digitized it and put it into my Google Drive, so now I have it. But as I started to read, I remember the paper, and I remember Dr. Ellenson giving me praise, and I thought this would be great to get back to this. But it's an 18-page term paper I wrote 21 years ago. I didn't remember. And as I read it, and then I compared it to the piece that you got when you came in, is from a book that was published this year called Lights in the Forest and it was edited by Rabbi Paul Citron, who used to work at Stephen Wise Temple back in the day, and his son, Mike, is a very good friend of mine. And it includes essays from 20 rabbis, and it's nice. Each rabbi was asked to write basically no more than 2 pages on a variety of topics: God, Jewish peoplehood, reward and punishment, suffering. And so I looked at what I wrote, this letter I wrote to God, and I saw the same elements of kind of everything I spoke about in terms of creation, in terms of God's role in revelation, in terms of God's role in redemption. So I guess in that sense, I'm conservative with a small c. Haven't changed my theology much in 20 years. How about you?
That's nice. I think I would say something similar, that I don't think I've changed the basic outlines of my theology. I think I've become more emotional about it, if anything. One of the questions we used to ask Rabbi Schulweis, so that he would get asked all the time when he would talk about God, because Rabbi Schulweis comes across as a very cerebral, rational person. And people would ask him all the time, but what about a personal God? What about a God I can talk to, a God I can pray to? And he would talk about the idea that something can be personal without being personalist. And what he meant by that was, what he meant by that was, when he would talk about Adonai, the transformative power that's in us, right? When he would talk about people that he had met, especially he was interested in Holocaust survivors, Christians who had saved Jews during the Holocaust. And whenever you tell those stories, your tears well up in your eyes. You tell the story of Raoul Wallenberg. We saw Oskar Schindler in the movies. You tell the story of Sempo Sugihara, the great Japanese diplomat who saved 3,500 yeshiva scholars in Kovno.
and was condemned by his government and died in ignominy. He was completely dishonored when he got back to Japan. And it was only 25 years, 30 years later, that when his story was told and he was honored at Yad Vashem, that the Japanese government gave his family the pension that they owed him. So you talk about a man who risked absolutely everything that was dear to him in his life to save 3,500 strangers. Right? You talk about the people that he would meet, and these stories give us a shiver, and they make us feel, they give us tears, because that power of human beings to transcend their interests, to transcend their own needs, to go beyond their own desires, to go beyond what's good for them, to do what's right in the world. That quality of moral courage, is so beyond us. That's the transcendent within the human being. That's what Rabbi Schulweis would call Adonai, and you begin to recognize that. And if you get good at that after a while, you start looking, you find that all over the place. Right? I did a funeral service for somebody who had been debilitated for a long time, and the family members told me, don't forget to thank so-and-so, Jose, who was his caregiver for the last 10 years. So I said, I met Jose, and who is Jose? Jose is a Filipino guy in his 40s who spent the last 10, 15 years taking care of this gentleman selflessly. And you say, why do you do that? Why does a person do this? And this guy wasn't easy to live with, let me tell you. And the family was so grateful for this stranger who came out of nowhere to give love and care and concern on such a deep human level to their loved one. And you find these stories all over the place. So I think it's not so much that my theology has changed, but I've become more sensitive to these things when I find them in the world. And they move me. They just move me tremendously when I see these things happen. So that's how I think that's how I've developed. Yes, please.
Many years ago, a rabbi said to me, you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. Mm-hmm. You just have to follow his laws. Mm-hmm. What's your response to that?
What do you think?
I would agree that to be Jewish, you don't have to believe in God. I would say that you also don't have to follow God's laws. You would still be Jewish. You'd just be a lousy Jew from the perspective of our tradition. And I don't mean that, and that's not a throwaway, I'm not trying to be funny, but the way Jewish status has always functioned, if you are considered to be a Jew by the community, you're a Jew, even if you sin. So Elisha ben Abuya, who's a great rabbi of the Talmud, becomes, he becomes an apostate, violates publicly the fast of Yom Kippur and rides a donkey on Yom Kippur. He's still a Jew. He's put in cherem, he's excommunicated, but he's still a Jew. Even if you don't identify as a Jew, you're still a Jew in terms of status. Elie Wiesel once said that there's no such thing as, good Jews and bad Jews. The way we think about being a good Jew is any Jew who wants to be better. So maybe it's you want your faith to be stronger. Maybe it's you want your acts of chesed to be deeper. You want your love of tradition to be more deeply felt. So that would be my encouragement to any one of us, wherever we are, wherever we find ourselves. I try to think about a lot of Jewish practice in terms of that continuum too, not binarily. So do you keep kosher? You don't keep kosher, but how do you eat Jewish? And here's how I eat Jewish, and there's, I keep a kosher home and we have separate dishes, and I find that to be meaningful, even though I didn't grow up with that, but that speaks to me. But for some people it might be that, there are certain foods I avoid, or there are certain foods there's nothing I avoid, but there are certain foods that I really enjoy that are Jewish. So it's more of a continuum than a binary way of looking at it. And maybe belief in God is the same way, that it's a continuum. And you might experience it as a pendulum too. It might be that there are moments in your life that your faith is so deeply felt. I was talking to a colleague of ours who was a study partner of mine on the Hartman program that Eddie did as well. And I called him for our weekly chavruta, and because we didn't live in the same town, and I said, how are you doing? He said, my amuna's in the crapper, which I thought was an elegant and poetic way of putting it. My amuna's in the crapper. I said, tell me about it. He said, I'm going through a really hard time spiritually, and my amuna, my faith is just, it's in the toilet. And sometimes any one of us feels that way, and other times my amuna's, in the Shemayim.
Yeah. I think
Please don't quote me on my amunas in the crapper. I would appreciate it. As I said that, I thought maybe it'd be better not to say this, but it's 9:09 at night, and the filter is slowly being removed.
Good. Let's take one more question, and then we're going to call it a
In the
night.
Torah, God is referred to by more than one name.
Right.
And how do you relate to God in his various names?
Good question. The names of God.
There's hundreds of them. When I would teach liturgy, I would tell the students that basically every chatimah, the seal of every blessing includes another name for God. God is Gal Yisrael. God is Oseh Shalom. God is Ohev Yisrael. Every one of those is another name for God, and I think it's helpful and freeing. So not just God is Yud He Vav He and God is Elohim, or some of the classic distinctions, or I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but God is Oseh HaShalom. God is Rofeh HaCholim. So I find that very helpful. The Kabbalists, would expand upon that, and mystics in other traditions, in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, it's infinite emanations of God, and yet it's still part of a monotheistic whole. It's part of one entity, but all of these emanations show you how complex and broad and deep God is.
Yeah, I think that's the answer is, if the tradition was so deeply committed to teaching monotheism, one God, it should have had one name for him. I mean, it undermines the monotheism to have all these different names, because it draws you to think that God has all these different personalities, right? So what are they trying to say by having all these different names? It's not that God has all these different names, it's that we have all these different ways of calling on God, which means that the point of it is to say that all these different experiences that we have something in common. They're all united in a certain thing. And I would tell you that the thing they're all united in, what they're trying to tell you, is that all of them have to do, as we said a moment ago, with transcending the self. We are all born as a self. Right? Anyone who's ever raised a 2-year-old knows what self means, right? Mine! Mine! And there are people that never outgrow that 2-year-old, right? There are people that are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old walking around. They look like they're 80 on the outside, or 60 on the outside, or 40 on the outside. Some of them are running for president. But inside, they're a 2-year-old. Mine, 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 me. Infantile egocentrism. It takes a tremendous act of development and growth, and I would say an act of will, to transcend infantile egocentrism, and realize that you belong to me, and that my responsibility is to bring wholeness to you, and that if I can heal you, and I can help you, and I can help you, and I can feed you, and I can lift you up, I feel bigger myself. And that's the spiritual tradition, right? The step out of the self into, or rather, not the step out of the self, but the opening of the self to include the other, means that I transcend the self, and the self becomes so much bigger. And God is the self that encompasses the whole world. You see? So you have all these different names for God because you have all these different moments when you and I are given an opportunity to step outside the self and say to somebody else, you belong to me. Right? You're all going to drive home in a few minutes, and someone's going to signal to move into your lane.
It happens on LA freeways and LA streets all the time. And you're given a huge moral choice at this point.
Wait, what's a signal?
Cut the son of a gun off so you could get home a fraction of a second earlier, or drop back a little bit and let him get into your lane. Because you know what? You're not that's a big hurry to get home. And that guy wants to get home just like you want to get home. You know? And I use that that's a classic LA example of transcending the self. Do you let the rabbi onto the freeway? And if you don't blame him for speaking too long when you come to shul Shabbos, you know? You know, transcending the self, all of the different names of God have to do with our experiences that when I transcend myself, when I open myself up to include somebody else, I have this remarkable sense of the meaningfulness of my existence, the purposefulness of my existence, and the fact that I'm connecting with something bigger than me. And that's why they're all the names of God. They're all pointers to these experiences which lie waiting for you if only you'd pick them up. I want to thank Rabbi Zweiback for being with us.